The rain lashed against the windows of the Blackwood Manor, a decaying Victorian estate that sat atop a jagged cliff. Detective Elias Thorne stood in the center of the grand hallway, his eyes fixed on a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. This was room 402. For 20 years, it had remained sealed behind a heavy iron padlock and several layers of police tape that had long since yellowed and cracked. The mystery of room 402 was a legend in the town of Oakhaven. 2 decades ago, a wealthy businessman named Arthur Sterling had entered that room at precisely 10 p.m. His security team stood right outside the door. There were no windows in the room, no secret passages, and the walls were made of solid stone. Yet, when his assistant knocked the next morning, there was no answer. When they broke down the door, the room was empty. Arthur Sterling had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a half-filled glass of scotch and a burning cigarette in the ashtray. Elias pulled a heavy set of keys from his pocket. He had been obsessed with this case since he was a rookie. Now, as the lead investigator on cold cases, he had finally secured the permission to reopen the room. The lock groaned as he turned the key, a sound like a dying animal. The door creaked open, revealing a thick layer of dust that danced in the beam of his flashlight. The room was exactly as the crime scene photos described. Velvet curtains were still drawn tightly. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and dried tobacco. Elias stepped inside, his boots leaving clear prints on the gray floor. He walked over to the desk. The glass of scotch was now just a sticky residue at the bottom of the crystal tumbler. The cigarette had long ago turned to ash, leaving a dark scorch mark on the mahogany wood. He began to tap on the walls, listening for any hollow sounds that might indicate a hidden compartment. Nothing. He checked the floorboards, prying a few up with a small crowbar. Solid stone lay beneath. He looked up at the ceiling. No vents, no hatches. It was a perfect box. "How did you do it, Arthur?" Elias whispered to the shadows. As he turned to leave, his flashlight caught a glint of metal near the corner of the rug. He knelt down and pulled back the heavy fabric. There, etched into the floor, was a small, circular symbol, a sun with an eye in the center. It wasn't a trapdoor, but a mark. He recognized it immediately. It was the crest of the Silent Hand, an underground society that had disappeared around the same time as Sterling. Suddenly, the heavy oak door slammed shut. Elias lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He heard the distinct sound of the iron padlock clicking into place from the outside. He was trapped in the same room where a man had disappeared 20 years ago. Then, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls. Not from the hallway, but from the very air around him. The scratching sound grew louder, a rhythmic scraping of nails against stone. Elias swung his flashlight toward the corner where the sound originated, but the beam revealed nothing but empty shadows. He threw his shoulder against the door, but the reinforced oak felt like a mountain. There was no way out through the front. He returned to the circular symbol on the floor. He pressed his thumb against the center of the carved eye. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a subtle vibration hummed through the soles of his boots. The desk in the center of the room began to slide back on its own, revealing a narrow slit in the floor that had been perfectly concealed by the desk's heavy legs. It wasn't a door for a person. It was a slot, barely wide enough for a thin sheet of paper. Elias shone his light into the slit. Deep down in the darkness, he saw the glint of white. Using a pair of tweezers from his forensic kit, he reached in and pulled out a series of thin, laminated cards. Each card contained a name, a date, and a set of coordinates. The first name on the list was Arthur Sterling. The date was the night of his disappearance. The scratching stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, a cold breeze swept through the room. Despite there being no windows, Elias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He realized the temperature in the room was dropping rapidly. His breath began to mist in the air. He looked back at the cards. The last name on the list sent a jolt of electricity through his spine. It was his own name, Elias Thorne. The date listed was today's date. The coordinates matched the exact location of Blackwood Manor. This wasn't a disappearance, Elias muttered, his voice trembling. It was a selection. Suddenly, the floor beneath the rug began to tilt. The entire room wasn't just a room. It was a massive, slow-moving elevator. The sound he had heard wasn't scratching, it was the sound of giant gears grinding behind the masonry. The room was descending deep into the cliffside. As the room settled with a heavy thud, the back wall, the one Elias had checked for hollow spots, simply slid upward. It revealed a vast underground chamber, lit by the flickering glow of hundreds of candles. In the center of the chamber stood a large, circular table. 12 figures sat around it, draped in heavy black robes, with the Sunandai symbol embroidered in gold on their chests. In the center of the table sat an old man, his skin like wrinkled parchment. Beside him, looking remarkably unchanged, despite the passage of 20 years, was Arthur Sterling. He wasn't a victim. He was presiding over the meeting. "Welcome, Detective," Sterling said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "We have been waiting for someone with your persistence to find the way down. The locked room was never meant to keep people out. It was a filter to find those worthy of coming in." Elias reached for his holster, but his hand froze. He realized that the air in the chamber was thick with a sweet, cloying incense. His vision began to blur. The figures at the table stood up in unison. Elias tried to fight the heaviness in his limbs, but the incense had done its work. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor of the hidden chamber. The robed figures moved with a ghostly silence, forming a perfect circle around him. Arthur Sterling stepped away from the table, his footsteps echoing like a ticking clock. "You spent years looking for a ghost, Elias," Sterling said, looking down at the detective with a mixture of pity and pride. "But in Blackwood Manor, ghosts are merely shadows cast by those who hold the light. I didn't vanish by magic. I vanished because the world above had become too small for the work we do here." Elias struggled to find his voice. "The list, the names, why am I on it?" Sterling knelt beside him, the candlelight reflecting in his cold, gray eyes. "Because you are a seeker. For 20 years, you ignored the easy answers. You didn't settle for the theory of a runaway businessman or a secret murder. You kept digging. That obsession is a rare fuel, Elias. It is the only thing that keeps the silent hand moving forward." The old man at the head of the table stood up. He held a silver chalice, engraved with the same Sunandai symbol. "The locked room is a mirror," the old man rasped. "Most people look at a locked door and see a dead end. A few see a challenge, but only the chosen see a transition." Sterling reached into Elias's pocket and pulled out the detective's badge. He tossed it into a small fire pit, burning in the corner of the room. The leather curled and the metal blackened. "Elias Thorne died tonight in room 402, Sterling announced to the room. "The police will find the door locked from the inside. They will find your footprints leading to the center of the room. And then, nothing, just like me. You will become a legend, a mystery that will haunt the next generation of detectives." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline as the horror of the situation set in. He wasn't being recruited. He was being erased. He forced his hand to move, inching toward his jacket's inner pocket. He didn't have his gun, but he had his digital recorder, the one he always kept running during investigations. "The world will know," Elias wheezed, his fingers brushing the plastic casing of the device. "The world knows only what we show them," the old man replied, gesturing to the walls of the chamber. Elias followed his gaze and saw rows upon rows of filing cabinets. They contained the secrets of every politician, every judge, and every officer in the state. "We don't just hide, Elias, we manage. And now, you will help us manage the truth." Two hooded figures grabbed Elias by the arms and dragged him toward a stone archway at the far end of the hall. Beyond the arch lay a labyrinth of tunnels that stretched deep into the heart of the cliff. "Wait," Elias shouted, his voice regaining some strength. "If the room was a filter, what happened to the ones who failed? The ones who didn't find the symbol?" Sterling paused, a dark smile playing on his lips. He pointed toward the heavy stone pillars supporting the chamber's roof. "The foundation of this manor is built on the bones of those who weren't clever enough to find the way down, but too curious to be left alive." Elias was dragged through the stone archway, his feet scraping against the uneven ground. The air here was damp and carried the salt of the nearby sea. The tunnels were a hive of activity. People in plain clothes, not robes, were frantically sorting through papers, monitoring wall-sized maps, and typing on silent high-end computers. This was the engine room of the Silent Hand. "This is the reality of power," Sterling said, walking alongside the captive detective. "It isn't found in speeches or at ballot boxes. It's found in the information that never reaches the public. We are the gatekeepers of the things the world isn't ready to know." They reached a small, cell-like room, carved directly into the rock. It was surprisingly modern, equipped with a desk, a laptop, and a single bed. The hooded figures shoved Elias inside and stepped back. The heavy iron bars didn't slide shut. Instead, a thick glass partition hissed into place, sealing the room hermetic. "You have 48 hours to decide, Ilias," Sterling stated, leaning against the glass. "On that desk is the file for the Oakhaven port scandal from 5 years ago. You remember it. The case that was dropped because of lost evidence. You were the one who complained the loudest when that evidence vanished." Elias looked at the desk. A thick manila folder sat there, mocking him. "The evidence didn't vanish," Sterling continued. "We took it because if that scandal had gone to trial, it would have collapsed the town's economy. Thousands would have lost their jobs. We chose the lesser evil. Read the file. See if you would have made a different choice." Sterling turned to leave, but Elias hammered his fist against the glass. "You can't keep me here. The department will come looking. My partner knows I was coming to the manor." Sterling stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "Your partner, Detective Miller. He's the one who gave me the key to room 402 tonight." "Elias, who do you think suggested you reopen the cold case in the first place?" The world seemed to tilt beneath Elias's feet. Miller, his partner of 10 years, the man who had been at his wedding, the man who had held his daughter at her christening. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "Sleep, Elias," Sterling said softly. "The realization is always the hardest part. Tomorrow, you will see that we aren't the villains. We are the architects of peace." The lights in the tunnel dimmed, leaving Elias in the sterile glow of the small room. He sat on the edge of the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the digital recorder in his pocket. It was still on. He had recorded Sterling's confession, the mention of the Silent Hand, and the betrayal of Miller. But as he looked at the glass partition and the guards patrolling the hallway, he realized a recording was useless if it never left the cave. He looked at the laptop on the desk. It wasn't connected to the internet, at least not the public one. It was a closed circuit. If he opened the laptop, the screen flickered to life, showing a login prompt. Beneath the prompt was a hint: the eye that sees the sun. Elias thought back to the symbol on the floor of room 402. He remembered the number of rays coming off the sun. He typed SUAN13E. The system unlocked. He didn't find a way out, but he found something better. The laptop was connected to the manor's internal security system. He could see the hallway, the grand foyer, and most importantly, the control mechanism for the locked room elevator. If he could trigger the room to ascend, while the manor's nightly cleaning crew was there, he might create enough of a distraction to slip out. But there was a catch. The control panel required a physical bypass from the server room, which was 2 levels up. He began to scan the files on the desktop, looking for any weakness in their armor. That's when he saw a folder titled Project Leviathan. He clicked it. His eyes widened as he read the first page. It wasn't just about managing scandals or local politics. They were planning to trigger a global financial collapse, to reset the world's hierarchy. "I'm not joining you," Elias whispered, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to burn this whole place down." Elias didn't have much time. He knew that, in a place like this, every keystroke was likely being monitored by some silent observer in a dark room. He worked with the frantic precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. Using his knowledge of police digital forensics, he began to write a simple script-to-logic bomb, designed to overload the manor's power grid by forcing the heavy elevator gears to grind against their safety locks. As the code compiled, Elias heard the heavy thud of boots outside his cell. The glass partition hissed and slid open. It wasn't Sterling this time. With Miller, his partner looked different in the dim light of the underground facility. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was etched with a guilt he couldn't quite hide. He wasn't wearing his police uniform. He was in a sharp, dark suit. "You should have just taken the deal, Elias," Miller said, his voice raspy. I tried to tell them you were one of us. I told them you'd understand the necessity of it all. The necessity of what, Miller? Of burying the truth, of killing anyone who asks the wrong questions. Elias stood up, keeping his body between Miller and the laptop screen. It's about order, Miller snapped, stepping into the small room. The world is a chaotic, rotting mess. People need to be guided. They need to be protected from their own greed. The Silent Hand provides that stability by planning a global collapse. Elias countered, his eyes flickering to the laptop. 40% compiled. Saw the files. Miller. Project Leviathan isn't about stability. It's about a throne. Miller sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. I really didn't want it to end this way for you. Sterling wanted you to be his successor. But now, you're just another loose end. Miller reached into his jacket. But Elias didn't wait. He lunged forward, using the weight of his body to tackle Miller against the stone wall. The two men crashed to the floor, struggling for control of the suppressed pistol Miller had drawn. Elias was smaller, but he was fueled by a pure, cold rage. He slammed Miller's wrist against the corner of the desk, and the gun skittered across the floor. At that exact moment, the laptop chimed. Execution complete. Suddenly, the ground groaned. A deafening screech of metal on metal echoed through the tunnels. The logic bomb had worked. The massive gears of the Room 402 elevator were spinning out of control, drawing massive amounts of power from the manor's generators. The lights flickered and died. Emergency red strobes began to pulse, bathing the tunnel in a bloody light. Sirens wailed, and the sound of shouting filled the corridor. What did you do? Miller gasped, clutching his bruised wrist. I opened the door, Elias said, grabbing the pistol from the floor. He didn't kill Miller. Instead, he used the butt of the gun to knock him unconscious. He couldn't bring himself to execute his partner, but he couldn't let him interfere. Elias grabbed the laptop, tucked it under his arm, and sprinted out into the chaotic hallway. The guards were distracted, heading toward the elevator shaft where smoke was starting to pour out. Elias moved in the opposite direction, toward the ventilation maps he had memorized from the security files. He knew that every underground bunker had to breathe. He followed the scent of salt air and the faint hum of high-powered fans. He reached a massive steel grate. Behind it, a series of giant fans pulled air from the cliffside. Beyond the fans lay the jagged rocks and the crashing waves of the Atlantic. It was a long drop, but it was the only way out. Elias jammed the pistol into the fan's gears. The machinery screamed, sparks flying everywhere, until the blades ground to a halt with a violent jolt. He kicked out the grate and crawled through. He stood on a narrow ledge halfway down the cliff. Above him, Blackwood Manor was silhouetted against the stormy sky, smoke billowing from its chimneys. Below him, the white foam of the ocean churned in the dark. He took a deep breath, clutched the laptop, the only evidence of the Silent Hand's existence, and jumped. The freezing water of the Atlantic hit Elias like a wall of concrete. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and for a moment, the darkness of the ocean threatened to pull him under forever. But the weight of the laptop, sealed in its waterproof casing, reminded him of what was at stake. He fought against the current, his muscles screaming, until he reached a narrow strip of pebbled beach, nearly a mile down the coast from Blackwood Manor. He dragged himself onto the shore, shivering violently. He didn't head for the police station. He knew now that the reach of the Silent Hand went far beyond Miller. Instead, he made his way to a secluded cabin in the woods that he had bought years ago, under a false name, a place even Miller didn't know about. Inside the cabin, Elias stripped off his wet clothes and fired up a localized, encrypted satellite link. He plugged in the laptop. He didn't just have files. He had the master key to their communication network. As he began uploading the contents of Project Leviathan to a dozen independent whistleblower servers across the globe, a video call request popped up on the screen. There was no ID, just the symbol of the sun and the eye. He clicked Accept. Arthur Sterling's face appeared. He wasn't in the underground chamber anymore. He was sitting in a study, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking perfectly composed. You're a difficult man to kill, Elias, Sterling said, his voice crackling through the speakers. But you're making a mistake. You think the world wants the truth. You think if you show them the strings, they'll stop being puppets. They won't. They'll just find a new master who promises them safety. Maybe, Elias replied, his finger hovering over the send button. But this time, they'll know who's holding the strings. And they'll know that the locked room has a back door. If you press that button, you can never go back, Sterling warned. You will be a hunted man for the rest of your life. No home, no family, no identity. You'll be the ghost of Blackwood Manor. Elias looked at his blackened badge sitting on the desk. One he had pulled from the fire before escaping. He looked at the files that proved his best friend was a traitor. The man he used to be was already dead. I've spent my life solving mysteries, Arthur, Elias said firmly. It's time I became one. He pressed the button. A progress bar flashed. Uploading 100%. Transmission successful. Across the world, in newsrooms, government offices, and on millions of private screens, the secrets of the Silent Hand began to bleed into the light. The names of the 12 members, the details of Project Leviathan, and the truth about the disappearances were no longer hidden. Sterling's image on the screen didn't show anger. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and nodded. The game continues, Detective, but the board has changed. The screen went black. Weeks later, the police raided Blackwood Manor. They found room 402, exactly as it had been 20 years ago from the inside, silent and dusty. But when they broke down the door, they found something new. In the center of the room, on the mahogany desk, sat Elias Thorne's digital recorder. When the lead investigator pressed play, a single sentence echoed through the empty room in Elias's voice. The room was never the mystery. The mystery was why you stayed inside for so long. Elias Thorne was never seen again. Some say he's hiding in the mountains, watching the fallout of the truth he unleashed. Others say he's still deep underground, fighting a war in the shadows. But in the town of Oakhaven, they still tell the story of the man who walked into a locked room and turned the world outside in.